The flames had already devoured most of the cabin. By the time Celia Hargrave stumbled through the doorway, her wrists bound so tightly with rough hemp rope that the fibers had cut through skin to raw flesh beneath. Blood traced thin lines down her forearms, dripping from her fingertips to darken the Wyoming dust. The late summer sun hung low over the high plains, casting the world in shades of amber and crimson that made the fire seem almost beautiful until the heat hit her face like a physical blow, searing her lungs with each desperate breath. Black smoke twisted skyward in thick columns, carrying with it the acrid stench of burning timber kerosene. And something else, something that smelled like cooked meat and made Celia's stomach heave with the terrible knowledge of what that meant. The Crenshaws were still inside. Had been inside. She'd heard their screams 20 minutes ago before the roof collapsed. 5 men on horseback circled the inferno like vultures spiraling above carrion, and their silhouettes dark against the flames. Their mounts shifted nervously whites, showing in rolling eyes as the animals fought their riders' control. The men wore a patchwork of stolen identities. Union cavalry coats with tarnished brass buttons hanging loose over their frames, some still bearing the faded insignia of the A Colorado Volunteers Detachment. Leather chaps scarred and stained with years of violence. Wide-brimmed hats pulled low to shadow faces marked by smallpox scars, knife wounds, and the particular cruelty that came from living outside the boundaries of law and conscience. These were Pike's men. Deserters claimed jumpers and killers who operated in the lawless spaces between settlements where territorial authority existed only in theory. They were the fist that Ezra Kincaid used to crush anyone who stood between him and what he wanted: water rights, grazing land, gold claims. It didn't matter. If you had it, and Kincaid wanted it. Pike's men came in the night, and in the morning, there was only ash and silence. A 6th man stood on foot beside Celia, close enough that she could smell the rancid combination of tobacco whiskey and old sweat that clung to him like a second skin. Ned was his name, a wiry creature, with a face pocked by old smallpox scars that had left his skin looking like melted wax, and teeth so yellowed from chewing plug tobacco that they appeared almost brown in the firelight. He held a knife in his right hand, the blade long and slightly curved, the kind you used for gutting game or cutting throats, and his grip suggested he'd used it for both. He grinned as he reached out with his left hand and grabbed Celia's chin, his fingers digging into her jaw, hard enough to make bone grind against bone. He forced her face toward the light, turning her head this way and that, as if inspecting livestock at market. His fingernails were cracked and black with accumulated filth, and Celia could feel her gorge rising at the touch. "Look at this," Ned said, his voice carrying that particular mockery that came from a man who'd never faced consequences for his cruelty. Still got some fire in those eyes. Some fight left. I do appreciate a woman with fight. Makes it more interesting when you break her. The men on horseback laughed, a chorus of harsh sounds that blended with the roar and crackle of the burning cabin. One of them, a tall figure with a slouch hat and a graying beard that hung halfway down his chest, leaned forward in his saddle, his gloved hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. This was Pike himself, the man whose name was spoken in whispers across 3 counties associated with burned homesteads, tortured witnesses, and bodies found in ravines with hands bound and mouths stuffed with dirt. Lucas Pike had been a cavalry sergeant during the War Distinguished Service in Missouri and Kansas, 3 commendations for valor. Then something had broken inside him, maybe at Wilson's Creek, maybe at Pea Ridge. Maybe it had been broken all along, and the war just gave it permission to come out. He deserted in late '64, taking a dozen men with him, and they'd been living off violence and intimidation ever since. Now he worked for Ezra Kincaid, doing the things that even a ruthless rancher couldn't be publicly associated with. Pike spat a thick stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, the brown liquid spattering near Celia's bare feet. "Leave her be for now, Ned. We got what we came for. Let the fire finish the rest. Kincaid don't want no witnesses walking around telling tales. Ned's grin widened, showing those terrible teeth, and he pressed the flat of the blade against Celia's throat. Not hard enough to cut, not yet, but with enough pressure that she could feel the cold metal against her skin and imagine how easily it could open her neck, how quickly she would bleed out here in the dirt, while these men watched and laughed. Seems a waste, Pike. Woman like this alone out here, nobody to miss her. Could have some fun first. Orders is orders, Pike said, but there was no real conviction in his voice. He pulled a carved pipe from his saddlebag, turning it over in his hands admiringly. Even in the fading light, Celia could see the intricate patterns etched into the stone spirals representing buffalo symbols she didn't understand, but recognized as sacred. This was what they'd really come for, the pipe the Crenshaws had been safeguarding for a Cheyenne family, a ceremonial object worth more than money to the people it belonged to. Pike had stolen it, and the Crenshaws had died for trying to protect it. Celia closed her eyes, feeling the cold blade and the oppressive heat at her back, pressing in from opposite directions. Her pulse hammered in her ears like war drums, drowning out everything else. She thought about her father's store back in Red Oak, 15 miles southeast, the cramped back room where she slept on a straw-filled mattress that smelled of mildew and her own fear sweat. She thought about the trunk hidden under the counter containing her late husband Thomas's journals, careful documentation of Cheyenne and Arapaho languages and customs written in his precise surveyor's hand. She thought about the small Colt Model 1849 pocket revolver tucked beneath those journals, a weapon she'd fired exactly 3 times in her life, missing her target every time because her hands shook too badly to aim properly. She thought about Thomas himself, dead 5 years now, supposedly drowned while helping a family cross the Platte River during a spring flood. She thought about the investigating deputy Hank Tolliver and how quickly he'd closed the case. Accident, he'd ruled. Tragic but not suspicious. Nobody ever found the family Thomas had supposedly been helping. Nobody ever came forward to confirm the story. And Thomas's final words to her the morning he'd left had been about irregularities he'd found in some land surveys, about evidence of fraud he was planning to report to the Territorial Land Office. She thought about her father Ernest, whose mind had been rotting from tertiary syphilis for 3 years, turning him from a stern but fair preacher into a violent paranoid who beat her daily for imagined transgressions. The mercury treatments Dr. Marion prescribed had slowed the disease's progress, but couldn't reverse it. Ernest was dying by inches, and he was taking her with him. If this was the end, at least it would be quick. At least there would be no more waiting, no more enduring, no more pretending she was still alive, when everything inside her had died years ago. Then came the sound that changed everything, the rapid percussion of hooves moving fast across hard ground, cutting through the roar of flames and the nervous snorting of the horses. The men's heads snapped around hands, moving instinctively to weapons. From the rocky ridge to the east, perhaps a quarter-mile away, a lone rider descended at full gallop, his horse navigating the treacherous slope with a kind of reckless confidence that spoke of either desperation or supreme skill. The rider was lean and dark, his long black hair worn in 2 thick braids that swung with the motion of his movement. He wore a vest decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns of blue and white Cheyenne designs that told stories in a language Celia couldn't read, but recognized from Thomas's sketches. A Spencer carbine rifle rested across his saddle, the 7-shot repeating weapon that had turned the tide of more than one battle during the war. The brass receiver caught the firelight and seemed to glow like a warning. The rider Maddo, though Celia wouldn't learn his name for several minutes yet, didn't slow as he approached the circle of men. If anything, he urged his horse faster, leaning low over the animal's neck, and Celia realized with a shock of understanding that he was going to charge directly through them. At the last possible moment, Pike's men scattered their horses, wheeling away from this unexpected threat, and Maddo's mount slammed shoulder first into Ned, hitting him with enough force to lift the smaller man completely off his feet. Ned flew backward arms, windmilling, and landed hard on his back in the dirt. His knife sailed away, spinning end over end to land in the dust 10 feet away. He lay there stunned, the wind knocked out of him, mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Pike's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Hold fire, nobody shoots unless I give the word." But even as he spoke, he was raising his own rifle, aiming the barrel at the center of the intruder's chest. Maddo wheeled his horse around to face them, placing the animal between the armed men and Celia. Then he spoke 3 words in Cheyenne. His voice pitched low, but carrying clearly in the evening air. The words were formal, ritualized, the kind you used for challenges or declarations. Celia didn't know their exact meaning, but she recognized the cadence from phrases she'd memorized from Thomas's journals, words she'd whispered to herself on the worst nights when her father's fists had left her bleeding. And she'd needed something beautiful to hold on to, some reminder that the world contained more than violence and despair. Pike's expression changed, recognition flickering across his features. "You," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect or might have been fear. "The bear. Should have known you'd turn up eventually." Maddo's hand rested on the stock of his Spencer, but he didn't raise it. His eyes, almost black in the fading light, swept across the 5 armed men, calculating odds and distances with the kind of cold precision that came from extensive experience with violence. Then his gaze dropped to Celia, taking in her bound wrists, her torn clothing, the knife that had been at her throat moments ago. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You have something that does not belong to you," Maddo said in English, his accent thick, but his words carefully chosen and deliberately spoken. "The pipe. You will return it now." Pike laughed, but it was a harsh sound without genuine humor. "That old thing already sold it, friend. Kincaid's got it sitting on a shelf in his study like a hunting trophy. You want it back, go ask him nice. See how far that gets you before he has Tolliver arrest you for trespassing and vagrancy, then accidentally beats you to death in his jail cell." Maddo's jaw tightened further, the only visible sign of his anger, but his voice remained level. "Then you will take me to Kincaid. Now." "I don't think so." Pike shifted his rifle slightly, adjusting his aim. The other 4 men had recovered from their surprise and were spreading out, trying to flank Maddo's position. "I think you're going to turn around and ride out of here, and we're going to finish our business with the woman, and nobody needs to die today. Well, nobody else. The woman comes with me," Maddo said flatly. "Not a chance. She's a witness. Kincaid's orders are clear, no witnesses." Maddo glanced down at Celia again, and this time their eyes met and held. She saw no pity in his gaze, no softness or sympathy, only a cold assessment. He was measuring her, determining whether she was worth the risk. The moment stretched, and Celia found herself unable to look away. There was something in his eyes, a fierce intelligence, a determination that reminded her achingly of Thomas, who had believed that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. That integrity mattered even when it got you killed. Then Maddo reached into his belt with his left hand, keeping his right on the Spencer, and pulled out a knife. In one smooth motion, he leaned down from his saddle and slashed through the ropes binding Celia's wrists. The hemp fell away, and Celia gasped as blood rushed back into her hands, bringing with it a pins and needles agony that was somehow worse than the numbness. The skin beneath was raw, and bleeding red welts already forming where the rope had bitten deepest. Maddo pressed the knife's handle into her palm, his fingers rough and warm against her cold skin. "Keep it tight," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "When shooting starts, get behind the horse. Stay low." Celia's fingers closed around the knife handle, her hands trembling from shock and pain, and the sudden terrible weight of being armed, of having to make choices about violence. She stumbled backward until she was pressed against the horse's flank, feeling the animal's warmth and the powerful muscles shifting beneath its hide. Her shoulder brushed against Matto's boot, and she could feel his leg tense, ready to move in an instant. His breathing was deep and controlled the steady rhythm of someone who had trained himself to remain calm when everyone around him was losing their heads. Without thinking, almost instinctively, Celia matched her breathing to his, inhaling when he inhaled, exhaling when he exhaled, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. The heat from the fire still pressed against her back, like a living thing trying to consume her. But the presence of the horse and rider created a pocket of relative safety, a space where she could think clearly for the first time since Ned had dragged her from the cabin. Pike studied them both, his weathered face unreadable in the firelight. Celia could see him calculating weighing options. Pike was brutal, but not stupid. She could see the intelligence working behind his eyes. Killing a Cheyenne man this close to the reservation boundaries would bring questions he didn't want to answer, might bring Army investigators or even Indian agents looking into things. Kincaid's protection only went so far. On the other hand, letting the man ride away with a witness was its own kind of risk. Finally, Pike spat again and lowered his rifle slightly. "You know what, Bear? I'm feeling generous today. You want the woman so bad, take her. She can't tell anyone anything useful anyway. She don't know who we are, don't know who hired us. But you should know something. That pipe you're so fired up about, Kincaid's got it, like I said. And he's got a lot more than that. He's got documents, deeds, survey records. He's got half the territorial government in his pocket. You go against him, you'll end up like this cabin, nothing but ash and bad memories." He jerked his head at his men, and they began wheeling their horses around, breaking the circle. Ned scrambled to his feet, retrieving his knife from the dust, and gave Celia one last look that made her skin crawl, a look that promised this wasn't over, that their paths would cross again. Then he mounted his horse and followed the others. The sound of hooves faded gradually into the distance, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the plains, leaving only Celia Matto and the dying fire. The cabin had collapsed completely now, just a pile of burning timber and the terrible knowledge of what it contained. Celia felt her legs start to give out, the adrenaline that had been holding her upright suddenly draining away. Matto dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements economical and practiced, and caught her elbow before she could fall. His hand was steady and strong, and he guided her to sit on a flat rock a safe distance from the heat. His face was angular and weathered, marked by a small scar above his left eyebrow, and the kind of fine lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting against harsh sun and wind. He was perhaps 35, though it was hard to tell. "Why did you help me?" Celia asked, her voice hoarse from smoke and fear. Matto was already scanning their surroundings, his eyes never still, always watching for threats. "I did not come for you," he said bluntly without looking at her. "I came for the pipe. You were in the way." The words stung, but Celia understood. This wasn't charity. This wasn't rescue born of chivalry or compassion. This was something else, intersecting paths, coincidental necessity, the cold mathematics of survival. She nodded slowly, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill that was already settling over the plains as the sun sank lower. "Then I owe you nothing." He glanced at her then, and something flickered in his eyes, approval perhaps, or respect for her clear-eyed understanding of their situation. "Good. That makes everything simple." Behind them, the last wall of the cabin collapsed inward with a groan of tortured wood and a shower of sparks that spiraled up into the darkening sky. Matto took his horse's reins and led the animal away from the intense heat, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his entire life navigating the land. Celia followed, walking carefully over the rough ground, acutely aware of every stone and thorn beneath her bare feet. Her shoes had been torn off during the struggle, when Pike's men had grabbed her from the road, and her feet were already cut and bleeding. As they reached the base of the ridge where the air was cooler and she could breathe without feeling like her lungs were being seared, Celia looked back at the burning structure one last time. The Crenshaws were gone now. Tom and Mary and their 3 children, aged 6, 4, and 18 months, erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. She'd known them slightly, had sold them flour and coffee at her father's store, had admired Mary's quiet strength and Tom's determination to make something of his small claim near Beaver Creek. They'd died because they'd refused to sell their water rights to Ezra Kincaid. They died because they'd agreed to hide a sacred pipe for a Cheyenne family until it could be safely returned. They died because men like Pike existed to serve men like Kincaid, and the law did nothing to stop them. Mato paused, studying her with that intense, assessing gaze. "You speak Cheyenne." It wasn't a question, but Celia nodded anyway. "A little. My husband recorded phrases in his journals, words, custom stories. I learned them after he died. I don't understand most of it, but I remember the sounds." "Why?" Celia hesitated, searching for words to explain something she'd never articulated before. "Because they were beautiful. Because he thought they mattered, that languages and cultures were worth preserving, worth respecting. Because on the worst nights when things were difficult, those words reminded me that the world was bigger than my life, that beauty and meaning existed somewhere, even if I couldn't reach them." Mato said nothing for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gestured to the horse. "Get on. I will take you to town. You cannot walk barefoot in the dark. The land is rough. You will injure yourself badly. I don't need—" "You have 2 choices," he interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact. "Ride with me to Red Oak, or stay here alone in the dark with your feet bleeding and Pike's men may be coming back to finish what they started. Which do you choose?" When he put it that way, there was really no choice at all. Celia allowed him to help her mount, pulling herself up behind the saddle. The horse was warm and solid beneath her, its breathing steady and somehow comforting. Mato swung up in front of her, settling into the saddle with the ease of long practice. "Hold on," he said, and started the horse down the slope at a careful walk. Celia wrapped her arms around his waist to steady herself, feeling the solid warmth of him through the beaded vest and the buckskin shirt beneath. His body was lean and hard, all muscle and bone, with no softness, shaped by a life of constant physical work and hardship. She could feel his heartbeat strong and steady like a drum, and the controlled rhythm of his breathing. They rode in silence, and the only sounds the soft thud of hooves on packed earth, the creak of leather, and the occasional call of a nighthawk hunting in the gathering darkness. Behind them, the glow from the burning cabin gradually faded to a dull ember on the horizon, then disappeared entirely. Ahead, the first stars began to appear, hard and bright and pitiless. Celia dozed against Mato's back, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. And when she woke, they were on the outskirts of Red Oak, that dying town that had become her prison. Red Oak was a corpse that didn't know it was dead yet. The town had been bypassed by the Union Pacific Railroad 3 years earlier. The route had gone 15 miles south, instead following an easier grade through the mountains, and since then, Red Oak had been bleeding out, slowly but inevitably. The population had dropped from nearly 300 to maybe 50. Stores had closed, families had moved on, buildings had been left to rot under the relentless assault of sun and wind and winter snow. The main street was a wide strip of packed dirt, lined with false front structures, most of them empty, now their windows dark and doors nailed shut. The few businesses that remained, the Silver Dollar Saloon, Henderson's blacksmith shop, her father's general store, clung to survival through sheer stubbornness and the patronage of scattered ranches and the handful of homesteaders who hadn't given up yet. Her father's store sat on the north end of the street, a squat wooden building with a faded sign that read, Hargrave & Co., in letters that had once been bright red, but had faded to a dull brownish pink. There had never really been a company. Thomas had been the company before his death, and Ernest had never bothered to change the sign after. Now it was just Ernest Hargrave and his daughter trapped together in a slow spiral of violence and madness. Matto guided his horse to the back of the building, staying in the shadows where they wouldn't be easily observed. The rear entrance was a simple wooden door with an iron latch that didn't lock, and there was little point in locking doors in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and any thief would know there was nothing worth stealing. He dismounted and helped Celia down, his hands steady on her waist until her feet touched the ground. "Will you be safe here?" he asked quietly. Celia almost laughed at the question. Safe? She hadn't been safe in this building for 3 years. But what could she say? That her father beat her daily when the disease made him paranoid and violent. That she stayed because a woman alone in the territory had nowhere else to go. No way to survive without male protection or independent means. That she'd thought about using that Colt revolver on herself more times than she could count. And the only thing stopping her was the stubborn, stupid hope that someday things might change. "I'll manage," she said instead. Matto studied her face in the starlight, and Celia wondered what he saw the bruises she'd tried to hide. With carefully arranged hair and high collars, the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, the defeat she carried in her shoulders, and the set of her mouth. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "I will be nearby for several days," he said. "I am looking for something. Documents that prove a surveyor falsified land boundaries after the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. My people lost thousands of acres because of lies written on paper. I believe those documents are hidden somewhere in this town, probably in a place where white men keep records. I need someone who can read English and knows this place. Someone who has reason to want justice." Celia met his eyes. "Why would you trust me? You don't know anything about me. I know you speak words from my language, with respect, not mockery. I know Pike's men were going to kill you, and you did not beg or cry. I know your husband was Thomas Hargrave, the surveyor, who worked with my people and treated us fairly. I have seen his name in old records. And I heard you last night through your window speaking Cheyenne phrases to yourself when you thought no one was listening. You said them correctly with proper feeling. That matters to me." Celia felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed and somewhat violated by the knowledge that she'd been observed in what she'd thought was a private moment. "What exactly do you need from me?" "Tomorrow we talk more. Tonight you rest. You are injured and exhausted. Think about whether you want to help. If you do, we work together. If not, I find another way." He paused, then added, "But I think you want justice. I think you are tired of being afraid." He swung back onto his horse and disappeared into the darkness without another word, as silently as he'd appeared, leaving Celia standing alone in the alley behind the store. She stood there for a long moment, the knife he'd given her still in her hand, her mind racing with questions and possibilities, and the first faint stirring of something that might have been hope, or might have been the simple recognition that she didn't have to accept the life that had been forced upon her. She slipped inside as quietly as possible, grateful for the darkness. The store's interior smelled of dust, old wood-flower tobacco, and the particular staleness that came from lack of customers and ventilation. She could hear her father's heavy snoring from upstairs. He slept in the room that had once belonged to her and Thomas, leaving her the cramped storage room at the back. It was his way of asserting dominance, of reminding her that everything in this building belonged to him, and she existed only by his sufferance. She moved carefully through the darkened space, navigating by memory and the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy front windows. Her feet left small bloody prints on the floor that she would have to clean before morning. In her narrow room, by the light of a single candle stub, she examined herself in the cracked mirror that hung on the wall. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat, her hair tangled and full of ash. Her dress, the brown calico that had seen better days, was torn at the shoulder and stained with blood and dirt. She looked like she'd been through a war. In a way, she supposed she had. She stripped off the ruined dress and washed herself with water from the chipped basin that served as her only bathing facility, scrubbing away the smoke and dirt and the lingering sense of Ned's hands on her face. The water was cold, drawn from the well that morning and sitting all day, and it made her gasp and shiver. She cleaned the rope burns on her wrists as best she could, wrapping them with strips of clean cloth torn from an old petticoat. When she was as clean as she could manage, she pulled on her nightdress, a shapeless linen garment that had once been white but was now a dingy gray, and sat on the edge of her straw mattress, staring at the knife Maddo had given her. It was a simple weapon, purely functional, with a wooden handle, worn smooth by years of use, and a blade about 6 inches long, single-edged, and wickedly sharp. The balance was perfect, designed for someone who knew how to use it. Thomas had taught her basic knife skills, how to cut rope, prepare food, basic camp tasks, but never how to use it as a weapon, how to drive it into human flesh, how to kill. The thought made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to imagine it anyway. If she was going to survive, if she was going to do more than just survive, she needed to be prepared for violence. She placed the knife under her thin pillow and opened the trunk that held her few possessions. Thomas's journals were at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and mice. She pulled out the most recent one, dated from 1871, the year before his death, and opened it carefully. His handwriting was as neat and precise as she remembered, each letter formed with the careful attention of someone who took pride in creating permanent records. One entry dated April 15th, 1871, caught her eye. Met again today with Maddo Cheyenne, forbear the guide who has been assisting me with the resurvey of the northern sections. He is quiet but observant, with a sharp intelligence that many of my colleagues would dismiss or fail to recognize due to their prejudices. He speaks adequate English, learned from missionaries and traders, and in exchange for my surveying instruction, he is teaching me Cheyenne words and phrases. We discussed the boundary changes from the 1868 treaty, and he showed me the original markers that his people placed. I have found significant discrepancies. Some boundary markers have been moved as much as 3 miles west of their proper positions, effectively transferring thousands of acres from reservation land to unclaimed territory that is then available for white settlement or purchase. When I pointed this out to Horace Kellen, the territorial surveyor, he became defensive and suggested I was mistaken. I am not mistaken. The evidence is clear. I will document everything and file a formal complaint with the Federal Land Office. Maddo looked at me with sad eyes when I told him this and said that honesty does not matter when those in power control the records. I fear he may be right, but I must try. Some things are worth fighting for even when the odds of success are vanishingly small. Celia stared at the entry, her heart pounding. Thomas had known Maddo, had worked with him, had discovered the same fraud that Maddo was now trying to expose. And 3 days after writing this entry, Thomas had left to verify some survey markers near the Platte River crossing. He'd kissed her goodbye that morning, told her he loved her, said he'd be back in 4 days. Instead, Deputy Hank Tolliver had come to the door 6 days later to inform her that Thomas's body had been found caught in a log jam downstream, drowned while trying to help an unnamed family cross the swollen river. Except now, reading this entry with new eyes, Celia understood what she'd been too grief-stricken to see clearly 5 years ago. Thomas hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered. Murdered to silence him before he could file that report, before he could expose the fraud that must have made someone very wealthy and powerful very nervous. Someone like Ezra Kincaid, who owned the Boxey Ranch, who controlled water rights across 3 counties, who had connections to the territorial governor and the federal land office, who employed men like Pike to do his dirty work. Celia closed the journal carefully and returned it to the trunk, but she didn't put the oilcloth back over it. She had a feeling she'd be needing these journals very soon, that they contained evidence that might be crucial. Her hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. From anger. From the slowly building fury that came from understanding how much had been taken from her, how many lies she'd been told, how her husband's murder had been covered up and forgotten, while his killers walked free and prospered. She lay down on her mattress, pulling the thin blanket over herself, but sleep was impossible. Above her, Ernest's snoring continued, occasionally interrupted by muttered words. She couldn't make out fragments of sermons, accusations against imaginary enemies, pleas for forgiveness from a by-thunder, who had apparently stopped listening years ago. Celia closed her eyes and whispered one of Thomas's Cheyenne phrases into the darkness. Nea is. Strength. It was what she would need. What she was going to find, somehow, from somewhere deep inside herself, where it had been buried under years of fear and violence and learned helplessness. Tomorrow she would talk to Maddo. Tomorrow she would begin to fight back. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply be angry, to let the fury burn in her chest, like a coal warming her from the inside, reminding her that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant smell of smoke from the Crenshaw cabin, a reminder of what happened to people who stood up to Ezra Kincaid. But it was also a reminder that Celia had survived when she should have died, that Maddo had appeared at precisely the right moment, that sometimes the impossible happened if you were stubborn enough to keep breathing. She drifted finally into an uneasy sleep and dreamed of fire and dark eyes that saw too much, and a pipe carved with spirals representing buffalo, and Thomas's voice reading from his journal over and over. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds of success are vanishingly small. Celia woke to the familiar sound of her father's voice, raised in anger, echoing through the thin walls like a herald of the new day's violence. She sat up quickly, her body moving on autopilot, 5 years of conditioning, making her respond to that tone before her mind had fully processed consciousness. Gray dawn light filtered through the single grimy window of her room, revealing dust motes dancing in the air like tiny ghosts. Ernest's footsteps thundered overhead, heavy and erratic, and she could hear the crash of objects being thrown. "Where are they? Where did you hide them, you lying thief? I know you took them, just like your mother, always stealing, always plotting against me." Celia dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her gray calico work dress. The fabric was thin from washing and mending, and it hung loosely on her frame. She'd lost weight over the past year, her body consuming itself from the stress. She wrapped a faded blue scarf around her neck to hide the bruises from 3 days ago when Ernest had grabbed her throat during one of his episodes. The bruises had faded from purple to yellow-green, but they were still visible enough to draw questions she couldn't answer. Her wrists still raw from yesterday's ropes she covered with long sleeves despite the growing heat of the day. She pinned her dark hair back in a severe bun, pulling it tight enough to give herself a headache. The pain helped her focus, helped her maintain the careful blank expression that was the safest way to interact with Ernest when he was like this. She stepped into the main store to find her father had already descended from upstairs, and the scene was chaos. Goods had been pulled from shelves and scattered across the floor, bags of flour, split open cans of beans dented, and rolling bolts of cloth unrolled and trampled. Ernest stood in the middle of the destruction, like an Old Testament prophet calling down by thunder's wrath, his nightshirt hanging off his gaunt frame, his gray hair standing out in wild tufts. His eyes, when they locked on Celia, were fever-bright and unfocused. There you are, he hissed, advancing on her with his right hand raised. Where are they? The papers that man gave me. Pike, his name was. Deserter trash, but he had papers. Said I should hide them, said they'd be worth money someday. Where did you put them? Celia kept her voice level, and calm. The tone she'd learned through painful trial and error would sometimes penetrate his delusions. Father, I don't know anything about any papers. I haven't touched your things. Why don't you sit down and let me make you some coffee? Don't lie to me. Ernest's hand shot out and grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging into the muscle with surprising strength for a man so wasted by disease. You're always sneaking around, always going through my things. You stole from me just like your whore mother stole from me. She's the one who gave me this sickness, you know. Put it in me to punish me for being righteous. And now you're trying to finish what she started. His spittle flecked her face as he shouted, and Celia forced herself not to pull away, not to react. Resistance only made it worse. Mother died of pneumonia when I was 12, Father. She never hurt you. The sickness came from before. From a mistake you made, that's all. It's not anyone's fault. Lies. He shook her hard enough to make her teeth clack together. Everything you say is lies. But I see through you. I see the devil working through you, trying to destroy me, trying to steal what's mine. He raised his other hand, palm open, preparing to strike her across the face. The bell above the front door chimed its bright tinkling sound, absurdly cheerful in the tense silence. Ernest froze, his hand still raised, and slowly turned to look at the doorway. Celia felt her breath catch in her throat. Maddow stood in the entrance, his hat in his hands, looking for all the world like an ordinary customer. But his dark eyes swept the scene with cold precision, taking in Ernest's raised hand, Celia's trapped arm, and the scattered goods on the floor, the dynamics of power and violence. His expression didn't change, but Celia saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and his right hand shift, slightly moving closer to where his belt would hold a weapon if he'd been armed. The store is open, Maddow asked politely, his English carefully neutral. I need supplies. Ernest released Celia's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling backward into the counter. He straightened his nightshirt with shaking hands, trying to compose himself to present the veneer of normalcy. The store's not open yet. Come back later. I can wait, Maddow said, not moving from the doorway. His eyes found Celia's, and she saw the question there. Are you safe? Do you need help right now? She gave a tiny shake of her head. Getting Maddow involved would only make Ernest worse later after Maddow left. Better to endure, to wait to survive until they could talk privately. Maddow's expression didn't change, but he gave the smallest nod of understanding. Perhaps the lady can help me while you finish your morning routine. Maddow suggested, his tone respectful but firm. I do not need much. Just some basic supplies. Ernest looked between them, his disease-addled mind trying to process this unexpected development. Finally, he waved his hand dismissively. Fine. She can help you. She's useless for anything else anyway. He shuffled toward the stairs, muttering to himself about thieves and demons and ungrateful daughters, as Celia released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. As soon as Ernest's footsteps faded upstairs, she moved quickly to start cleaning up the mess he'd made, sweeping flour back into bags, picking up scattered goods. Her hands were shaking, and she kept her face turned away from Maddow so he wouldn't see the tears of humiliation burning in her eyes. You do not have to pretend with me, Maddow said quietly, moving to help her pick up fallen cans. I understand what I saw. You don't understand anything, Celia said, her voice harsher than she'd intended. This is my life. This is all I have. If you're here to judge me for enduring it, you can leave. I am not here to judge. He set a can of beans on the counter with deliberate care. I am here to offer you a way out, but only if you want it. Celia looked up at him, then really looked at him, trying to read his intentions. His face was serious, his eyes direct and honest. After a long moment, she nodded. What do you need? Somewhere private to talk. Somewhere he will not interrupt or overhear. She glanced at the ceiling, listening to Ernest's footsteps pacing overhead. The cellar. It's below the storeroom and the door is thick. He never goes down there, says it's full of rats and devils. Maddo nodded. Show me. She led him through the back room to a narrow door that opened onto steep wooden stairs, descending into darkness. Celia grabbed a lantern from a hook on the wall, lit it with a match, and carefully made her way down Maddo, following close behind. The cellar was low-ceilinged and cramped, smelling of damp earth and old potatoes. Shelves lined the walls, holding preserved goods and emergency supplies. Maddo had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the support beams. But once they were both down and Celia had closed the door at the top of the stairs, they had privacy. The thick earth walls and heavy door muffled sound effectively. Down here, Ernest's pacing was barely audible, a distant rhythm like a heartbeat. Your father is very ill, Maddo said without preamble. I have seen this sickness before in white soldiers at the forts. The disease that comes from prostitutes. The mercury slows it, but cannot cure it. He will continue to worsen until he dies. I know, Celia said quietly. Dr. Marion in Cottonwood Springs has told me the same thing. He might have months, maybe a year. The violence will get worse. Eventually, he'll be unable to care for himself at all. Why do you stay? Where would I go? Celia heard the bitterness in her own voice. I have no money of my own. The store barely makes enough to buy supplies and pay for Father's medicine. A woman alone can't homestead. The law requires male claimants or widows with children. I could try to find work as a domestic servant or a seamstress in a larger town. But that requires money for travel and references I don't have. I could marry, but the only men in Red Oak are either ancient or cruel or both, and I have nothing to offer a decent man from elsewhere. So I stay. I endure. I survive. What if I offered you another option? Celia met his eyes. I'm listening. Maddo pulled a rolled piece of rawhide from inside his vest and spread it carefully on a relatively clean barrel head. The surface was covered with painted symbols in rust red and black, forming what was clearly a ledger or record of some kind. He traced the symbols with his finger as he spoke. This records injustices done to my people over the past 4 years. This spiral represents land taken by fraud. These crossed lines mark where documents are hidden. This symbol, like a buffalo's horn, indicates Ezra Kincaid's involvement. I have been keeping this record because if I am killed, others of my people can read it and continue the work. You think you'll be killed? It is likely. Men like Kincaid do not allow challenges to their power. But before I die, I want to expose the truth to create a record so overwhelming that it cannot be ignored or buried. Your husband was trying to do the same thing when he was killed. Celia's breath caught. You think Thomas was murdered? I know he was murdered, Maddo said flatly. I was at the Platte River crossing the day after he died. I saw where his body was found. The current there is not fast enough to drown a grown man who knows how to swim, and your husband was an experienced outdoorsman. I found marks in the mud suggesting a struggle, multiple sets of boot prints. And there was no family that he was supposedly helping. I checked with everyone living near the crossing. No one knew anything about it. The story was a lie, but by the time I found evidence, the spring floods had washed away most of the traces. I had nothing concrete enough to take to the authorities, and even if I had, Deputy Tolliver was the one investigating. He would have buried anything I found. Celia sank down onto a crate, her legs suddenly unsteady. I knew, she whispered. Deep down, I always knew. But hearing you confirm it. Why did they kill him? What did he find? He found proof that the boundary surveys after the 1868 treaty were fraudulent. Thousands of acres that were guaranteed to the Cheyenne and Arapaho were deliberately missurveyed, marked as unclaimed territory, and then sold to Kincaid at pennies per acre. Your husband documented everything, the moved boundary markers, the altered records, the correspondence between the territorial surveyor Horace Kellen and Kincaid discussing the adjustments. He was planning to file a formal complaint with the Federal Land Office. 3 days later, he was dead. And you think the documents he gathered are still hidden somewhere. I know they are. Before your husband died, he told several people that he had hidden copies of his findings in 3 locations across the territory. Pike's men found and destroyed one cache 2 years ago. The second cache was in the Crenshaw cabin, that's why Pike burned it yesterday. But the third cache is still out there, and I believe it is here in this town, in this store. Celia's mind raced. My father mentioned Pike selling him papers. He said it was 3 years ago, right after Thomas died. I thought he was delusional, but maybe he was telling the truth. Maddow finished. Pike might have taken some of your husband's documents and tried to sell them to your father, not realizing what they were worth. Your father hid them and then forgot about them as his illness worsened. If they're here, they could be anywhere, Celia said, looking around the cramped cellar. Father hides things when he's paranoid under floorboards, inside walls, and barrels of flour. Sometimes he burns things in the stove when he thinks they're dangerous. He might have destroyed them already. Then we search, Maddow said, and we hope. But there is something else I need. He rolled up his left sleeve, revealing his forearm. Celia leaned closer with the lantern, squinting in the dim light. She could see faint marks on his skin like old scars or faded tattoos, but they were barely visible, more shadow than substance. What is that? A map, Maddow said. Made with ink from plant dyes mixed with ash. It only becomes visible when warmed by fire or by rubbing ash into the skin. Watch. He reached for the lantern and held his arm close to the flame, not close enough to burn, but near enough that the heat washed over his skin. Gradually, the marks darkened, revealing a crude but functional map, etched into his flesh. Celia's breath caught as she watched the image emerge, a river, a cluster of buildings, representing a town's scattered marks, indicating specific locations, and one particular mark that seemed to correspond to their current position. That's extraordinary, she whispered. And dangerous. If Kincaid's men caught you, they'd cut your arm off to destroy the map. They would have to catch me first, Maddow said. And if they did, if they got close enough to take my arm, I would already be dead or dying. The map would be useless to them then. It is worth the risk. How many locations are marked? 5 caches originally. 2 have been found and destroyed. 3 remain. This mark, he pointed to the cluster of buildings, indicates a store on the north end of Red Oak's main street. This store. Then we need to search. Celia said, decision crystallizing in her mind. But not now, not during the day when Father might come down or customers might arrive. Tonight after he's asleep. I'll help you search every inch of this building if necessary. And in exchange, I take you and your father to Cottonwood Springs for treatment. I pay for the mercury and whatever else Dr. Marion prescribes. And when this is over, When we have exposed Kincaid's crimes and recovered my people's land, I help you start over somewhere new. I have some money saved, and I know people who will help. You will not be dependent on your father or on any other man unless you choose to be. It was more than Celia had dared hope for in 5 years. Freedom, agency, the chance to live a life she chose rather than one imposed on her by circumstance and violence. But it was also terrifying. Going against Kincaid meant risking everything, and the odds of success were vanishingly small. Men with Kincaid's wealth and connections didn't fall easily. But she thought of Thomas, of his belief that some things were worth fighting for. She thought of the Crenshaws, of Mary's quiet strength, and the children who had died screaming in the fire. She thought of Maddo's people systematically cheated out of their land by lies written on paper. She thought of all the other victims, past and future, crushed beneath the weight of men like Kincaid. "All right," she said, extending her hand. "Partners. We do this together." Maddo grasped her hand, his grip firm and warm. "Partners," he agreed. "We meet here tonight 2 hours after full dark. Bring your revolver. If we find the documents, we will need to move quickly. Kincaid will realize his theft has been exposed, and he will send men to silence us." They spent the rest of the morning being carefully normal. Celia served the few customers who came. Old Mrs. Henderson buying thread and needles, a ranch hand from the Double K picking up tobacco and ammunition. Maddo purchased legitimate supplies, coffee flour, salt, ammunition for his Spencer, paying with silver coins and leaving like any other customer. But throughout the day, Celia felt the weight of the knife tucked into her skirt pocket, a constant reminder of the choice she'd made, of the dangerous path she'd chosen. That evening, after she'd closed the store and prepared a simple dinner that Ernest refused to eat, she sat in her small room and checked the Colt revolver, making sure it was loaded and functional. The weight of it in her hands still felt alien and wrong, but she forced herself to practice the grip Maddo had shown her, to imagine aiming and firing, to prepare mentally for the possibility that she might have to use it. She'd never killed anything larger than a rat, had never even seen a human being shot. But she understood with cold clarity that the path she'd chosen would likely end in violence. When full darkness fell, and Ernest's snoring indicated he was deeply asleep, Celia slipped down to the cellar with a lantern and the revolver tucked into her waistband. Maddo arrived moments later, silent as a ghost, carrying tools, a pry bar, a knife cloth, rapping to muffle the sound of their work. They searched methodically and in near silence, communicating with gestures and whispers. They tested floorboards for hollow sounds, tapped walls for hidden cavities, examined barrels and crates for false bottoms. The work was slow and painstaking, made more difficult by the need for absolute quiet. After 2 hours, they'd found nothing. Celia was beginning to despair, thinking that Ernest had destroyed the documents or that they'd been wrong about the location entirely. Then Maddo, who'd been examining the floorboards near the stone foundation, gestured urgently for her to bring the lantern closer. One particular board, half hidden beneath a stack of empty burlap sacks, gave slightly under pressure when he tested it. He carefully pried it up, the old nails squeaking softly, and revealed a small cavity in the space between the floor joists and the earth below. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and decay. Celia's hands trembled as Maddo lifted it out and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a sheaf of papers covered in Thomas's precise handwriting, survey notes, boundary descriptions, mathematical calculations. There were sketches showing the original treaty boundaries from 1868, overlaid with the corrected boundaries from the 1870 resurvey, the differences stark and damning. There were copies of correspondence between Horace Kellen and Ezra Kincaid discussing adjustments and accommodations. And underneath everything was a letter in Thomas's hand, addressed to the Federal Land Office, laying out the evidence of fraud in meticulous detail. "This is it," Celia whispered, her throat tight with emotion. This is what Thomas died for. This proves everything. Maddow nodded, his expression grim, as he scanned the documents by lantern light. This proves the fraud, yes. But we need more. We need Kellen's original notes, his personal records. We need testimony from Pike about who ordered the killings and the intimidation. And we need the pipe physical evidence of theft. All of those things are at Kincaid's ranch, the Boxy. Then we're going to have to steal from Ezra Kincaid. Celia said, her voice steadier than she felt. Yes, and we will need to be very lucky and very careful, or we will end up like the Crenshaws. Maddow carefully rewrapped the documents and tucked them inside his vest. I have been watching the Box E for weeks. Kincaid is hosting a poker game tomorrow night. Territorial officials, ranchers, business owners. Important men. They will all be drinking and focused on cards. Security will be lighter than usual. It is our best chance. Our best chance to get killed, you mean? Maddow's expression was serious. Yes, possibly. But staying silent, doing nothing, that is a slower death, but just as certain. For my people, for people like the Crenshaws, for the memory of your husband. We must try. Celia thought about it for a long moment, weighing fear against anger, safety against justice. Finally, she nodded. Then we try. But you need to teach me how to shoot properly. If we're walking into danger, I need to be able to defend myself, not just carry a weapon I'm afraid to use. They spent the next hour in the darkness, behind the store, far enough from occupied buildings that the sound wouldn't wake anyone, walking with Maddow patiently teaching Celia the fundamentals of shooting. He showed her how to grip the Colt properly, how to align the sights, how to control her breathing, how to squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. She fired 15 rounds, and by the end was hitting a barrel roughly half the time at a distance of 20 feet. Not impressive by any standard, but a dramatic improvement over her previous experience. More importantly, her hands had stopped shaking. The revolver no longer felt quite so alien in her palm. She could imagine using it now, could see herself pulling the trigger if the alternative was death or capture. You learn quickly, Maddow said as they walked back toward the store. That is good. We will need every advantage. Maddow, Celia said, stopping him with a hand on his arm. Thank you for trusting me, for giving me a chance to fight back. I've felt powerless for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to make real choices, to act instead of just enduring. He covered her hand with his, a brief, warm pressure. You are stronger than you know. Survival takes strength. Enduring takes strength. Now you will discover what else you are capable of. They parted at the back door, and Celia slipped inside, her mind already spinning with plans and fears for tomorrow night. But for the first time in years, the fear was mixed with something else. Anticipation, purpose. The sense that she was finally moving towards something instead of just running away. She returned the Colt to its hiding place in her trunk and lay down, expecting to be too keyed up to sleep. But exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, and she dreamed of Thomas reading from his journals, and of Maddow with his map-marked arm, and of documents that proved the truth, and of a sacred pipe carved with spirals representing buffalo waiting to be recovered and returned to its rightful owners. Tomorrow she would walk into danger. Tomorrow she might die. But at least she would die fighting, and that was something. The story continues with the infiltration of the Boxy Ranch and the discovery of additional evidence, the harrowing escape, the twist about Pike's survival and location, and the revelation that Kincaid personally killed Thomas Ernest's redemptive sacrifice, and the climactic confrontation where Kincaid kidnaps Celia to force Maddow's hand. Due to length constraints, I'll continue with the climax and resolution. The poker game at the Boxy Ranch was everything Maddo had predicted, loud, drunken, full of territorial officials and wealthy ranchers who were too focused on cards and whiskey to pay attention to the servants moving through the house. Celia approached the ranch on foot as planned, wearing a borrowed black dress and widow's veil that made her nearly invisible. She entered through the kitchen door, claiming Mrs. Henderson had sent her to help serve, and the harried cook accepted her presence without question. For 2 hours, Celia moved through the house like a ghost, serving drinks and clearing plates while carefully observing. She noted that Kincaid kept his study locked, that Deputy Tolliver was present, and drinking heavily that the safe in the study required a combination. She watched as Kincaid's nephew, a careless young man already drunk, opened the safe to retrieve more cash for his gambling losses. And through careful observation from the hallway, she memorized the sequence of numbers he dialed. When the moment was right, when all the men were focused on a particularly large pot, she slipped into the study. The sacred pipe sat in a glass case on a shelf displayed like a hunting trophy. Rage surged through her, but she forced it down, forced herself to focus. She opened the safe with a memorized combination, finding not just money, but also a leather journal in Horace Kellen's handwriting and bundles of correspondence. She was stuffing documents into her bodice when she heard footsteps in the hall. No time to hide. She grabbed the pipe from its case and ran for the window, throwing it open and climbing through just as the door burst open behind her. Kincaid himself stood in the doorway, his face purple with rage. "Thief, stop her, stop." Celia hit the ground running, clutching the pipe and documents. Behind her, men were shouting, boots pounding. She saw Maddo's silhouette near the barn and sprinted toward him. He pulled her onto his horse, and they galloped into the darkness as gunfire erupted behind them. What followed was a nightmare chase across treacherous terrain, in darkness, prairie dog holes threatening to break the horses' legs, bullets whipping past the thunder of pursuing horses close behind. They crossed Beaver Creek at a dangerous ford, the water high and fast from recent rains. Celia felt the current pulling at them, trying to drag them under, but Maddo's strength and skill kept them upright and moving. They thought they'd escaped when they reached a narrow canyon that Maddo knew well, a place where a single rider could hold off many. But Pike's men had anticipated their route. 3 riders blocked the far end of the canyon, and when they turned back, Kincaid and Tolliver blocked the entrance with more men. They were trapped. "Give me the documents," Kincaid called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Give them to me and ride away. I'll let you go. You have my word." "Your word is worthless," Maddo called back, "like all your promises. Then you'll die here, both of you, and the truth dies with you." The gunfight that followed was brief and brutal. Maddo used the Spencer with deadly accuracy, dropping 2 of Pike's men before they could take cover. Celia fired the Colt, her hand steady, now driving the others back. But there were too many, and they had too little ammunition. Then salvation came from an unexpected source. A group of homesteaders appeared on the canyon rim, drawn by the sound of gunfire, Eli Moser, and a dozen others who'd been quietly watching the Boxy, waiting for a chance to strike back at Kincaid. They opened fire on Kincaid's men from above, and in the chaos, Celia and Maddo escaped through a narrow side passage that only Maddo knew existed. They rode hard for Red Oak, knowing they needed to gather Ernest and flee before Kincaid could regroup. But when they reached the store, they found it surrounded. Tolliver was there with 6 men waiting. The fight was savage. Ernest, in a moment of clarity, came out with an old shotgun and fired both barrels into Tolliver's deputies, giving Celia and Maddo time to get inside. But Tolliver returned fire, and Ernest took a bullet to the chest. Maddo dragged the old man to cover, while Celia provided covering fire. In his dying moments, Ernest's mind cleared completely. He looked at Celia with recognition and love, and with his last breath told her the truth: Pike wasn't dead. He'd escaped from a prison work detail 3 months ago and was hiding at an abandoned mine near Laramie. He wanted revenge on Kincaid and would testify if someone could get him to a federal marshal. The store caught fire during the fight, Tolliver's men using the confusion to try to burn them out. Ernest died in Celia's arms as the flames grew his last words, a plea for forgiveness. Maddo and Celia escaped through the coal chute, carrying Ernest's body and the precious documents. They buried Ernest at dawn and then began the dangerous journey to find Pike. It took a week of careful travel hiding from Kincaid's men who were searching for them across the territory. When they finally located Pike at the abandoned Sweetwater mine, he was a changed man, bitter, angry, eager for revenge. "Kincaid threw me to the wolves," Pike said. "I did his dirty work for years, and when I got caught, he bought off the judge to make sure I stayed silent. I'll testify. I'll tell everything. And I'll tell you something special, something about how your husband really died, Mrs. Hargrave." Celia's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I was there that day at the river crossing. Kincaid didn't just order the killing, he did it himself. Personally. Wanted to send a message, he said. He and Tolliver and 2 others held Thomas Hargrave underwater until he stopped fighting. I watched from the ridge. Kincaid enjoyed it, I could tell. That's the kind of man you're fighting." The revelation hit Celia like a physical blow. Kincaid hadn't just ordered Thomas's murder, he'd done it with his own hands, had felt Thomas's struggles and held him under anyway, had looked into her husband's dying eyes. Something cold and hard crystallized in her chest. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. They traveled to Laramie with Pike, gathering more evidence and allies along the way. Dr. Marion provided medical testimony. Ada Finch brought documentation of harassment and intimidation. Eli Moser organized the homesteaders into a formidable group. Judge Harrigan, one of the few honest officials in the territory, agreed to convene a grand jury. But Kincaid wasn't going to go down without a fight. While Maddo was meeting with the judge, Kincaid's men ambushed Celia in broad daylight on Laramie's main street. They grabbed her, chloroformed her, and rode out before anyone could react. She woke hours later in a nightmare bound hand and foot, in a stone building that she gradually recognized as the old Sweetwater mine. Kincaid sat across from her, and his smile was terrifying because it reached his eyes. "You've been a persistent problem, Mrs. Hargrave," he said conversationally. "Your husband was too. I enjoyed killing him, if I'm being honest. The way he fought, the way he struggled, it was satisfying. And now I'm going to use you to draw out that Indian who's been causing so much trouble. When he comes for you, and he will come, I'll kill him. Then I'll kill you. And then I'll burn all the evidence and go back to my ranch, and life will return to normal. You won't win." Celia said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Even if you kill us both, there are too many people who know the truth now. Too many witnesses. Your empire is crumbling, Kincaid." "Maybe," he conceded. "But I'll die rich and you'll die young. I consider that a fair trade." The hours that followed were some of the longest of Celia's life. Kincaid kept her bound but didn't torture her. He needed her alive and relatively undamaged as bait. She watched the sun track across the small window, measuring time, and prayed that Maddo would be smart enough not to walk into the trap. But she knew he would come. He'd promised to protect her, and Maddo kept his promises. Sunset was painting the sky crimson when Celia heard it, a single gunshot from outside, then silence. Kincaid's men stirred hands, moving to weapons. Another shot, and one of the guards posted outside didn't answer when called. Kincaid cursed and positioned his remaining 4 men at windows and doors. "He's here," Kincaid said, drawing his own revolver. "Good. Let's end this." What followed was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. Maddo used every skill he'd learned in a lifetime of survival, picking off Kincaid's men one by one. He used the terrain, the failing light, his intimate knowledge of the mine and its surroundings. He used misdirection and stealth and patience. Inside, Celia worked frantically at her bonds, using a sharp edge on the stone wall to saw through the ropes. Her wrists were bleeding again, but she barely felt it. She had to be ready when the moment came. 2 hours after sunset, only Kincaid remained alive. His men were dead or fled. Maddo's voice echoed from outside. "Release her, and you can walk away. Keep her, and you die here." Kincaid grabbed Celia, pressing his revolver against her temple. "Come in and face me like a man, or I paint these walls with her brains." Celia felt the cold metal against her skin and made a decision. She'd survived too much, fought too hard to die as a hostage. When Kincaid shifted his grip, slightly adjusting his position, she drove her elbow backward into his stomach with all her strength. He grunted, his aim shifting, and she threw herself sideways. The gun fired the bullet, passing so close to her head that she felt its heat. Then Maddo was there, crashing through the window in a shower of glass, his knife flashing. Kincaid fired again, missing. Maddo's knife found its target, driving deep into Kincaid's gun arm. The revolver fell, and the two men grappled, fighting with desperate strength. They were evenly matched. Kincaid was heavier and stronger, but Maddo was faster and more skilled. They crashed through the mine's old equipment, scattering tools and debris. Celia grabbed the fallen revolver with her bound hands and struggled to free herself from the ropes. Kincaid got his hands around Maddo's throat, choking him. Maddo's face darkened, his struggles weakening. Celia finally got one hand free and raised the revolver, but they were too close together, moving too much. She couldn't risk the shot. Then she remembered the knife Maddo had given her that first night. She'd carried it tucked into her boot. She reached down, found it, and in one smooth motion drove it into Kincaid's back just below the ribs. Kincaid screamed, his grip on Maddo's throat loosening. Maddo drove his fist into Kincaid's throat, crushing his windpipe. The rancher fell backward, blood pouring from the knife wound, gasping for air that wouldn't come. His eyes found Celia's, and she saw fear there for the first time. "That was for Thomas," she said quietly, "and for all the others you destroyed." Kincaid died slowly, drowning in his own blood, and Celia felt no remorse, only a cold satisfaction that justice had finally been done. The trial that followed was a formality. With Kincaid dead and Pike's testimony devastating to his remaining associates, the conspiracy collapsed quickly. Deputy Tolliver was arrested and sentenced to 20 years for murder and corruption. The fraudulent surveys were voided. Thousands of acres were returned to the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Homesteaders like Eli Moser regained their legitimate claims. The sacred pipe was returned to Maddo's people in a ceremony that Celia attended as an honored guest. The elders gifted her with a beaded vest, telling her she was welcome among them, that she had proven herself a friend to the people. Celia used the money from the territory's settlement compensation for her father's death, while assisting a federal investigation to purchase a small piece of land near Beaver Creek. She built a cabin there, simple but sturdy, and started a supply business serving homesteaders and travelers. She advertised that she served all people fairly regardless of race or origin, and her reputation for honesty spread quickly. Maddo helped her build the cabin, working alongside her through the long summer days. They didn't speak much about what was developing between them. Both had loved and lost, before both carried scars that made them cautious about giving their hearts again. But they worked well together, moving in comfortable synchronization, and the silences between them were companionable rather than awkward. One evening, 6 months after Kincaid's death, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Maddo's arm was around Celia's shoulders, and her head rested against his chest. They had become lovers the month before, tentatively. And then, with growing confidence, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patience and care. "I need to return to my people soon," Maddo said quietly. "I have been away too long. There are ceremonies to attend, records to update young people who need teaching." Celia's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "How long will you be gone? 2 weeks, maybe 3? He paused. "You could come with me, if you wanted. The elders have said you would be welcome, not as a visitor, as family." Celia looked up at him, searching his face. "Family? If you wish it." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin gently. "I love you, Celia. I did not expect to, did not plan for it, but it happened anyway. You are strong and brave and stubborn. You face impossible odds and fight anyway. You have a good heart. I would be honored if you would share my life in whatever way feels right to you. My people do not require white marriage ceremonies. We have our own ways of recognizing when 2 people belong together." Tears burned in Celia's eyes, happy tears this time, not grief or fear or pain. "I love you too. I think I have for a while, but I was afraid to say it, afraid it would disappear if I named it. But yes, I want to share your life. I want to meet your people and learn your language and build something real together." He kissed her then deep and thorough, and she felt something shift in her chest, not the closing of old wounds, but the opening of new possibilities. She had survived so much, lost so much, endured so much. But she had also fought back and won. She had claimed her own life, made her own choices, and now she was choosing joy. The next morning, they packed supplies and began the journey to the Cheyenne camp. Along the way, they stopped at Thomas's grave, a simple marker in the Red Oak Cemetery. Celia knelt beside it and placed a wildflower on the headstone. "I found out the truth," she said quietly. "I made sure the man who killed you paid for it. I finished what you started. I hope that's enough. I hope you're at peace now." The wind rustled through the grass, and Celia chose to believe it was Thomas giving his blessing. She stood, took Maddo's hand, and together they walked toward the future, uncertain perhaps, but no longer afraid. They would face whatever came next together, and that made all the difference. Final reckoning at Red Oak. A dawn broke thin and metallic over Red Oak, the kind of pale light that makes every window look like an eye. Smoke from last night's cook fires hung low along Main, and the ruts in the street were stitched with ice. Word had already moved faster than any rider that Tolliver had spirited a witness out toward the boxee, that Kincaid meant to force a confession and bury the ledger for good. They saddled in silence. The Cheyenne scouts rolled bedrolls with practiced snaps, faces set against the cold. The deputy buckled on his battered belt and checked the Spencer's feed one more time. The woman they had saved, who had been used and threatened, and at last believed, wrapped a borrowed shawl around her shoulders and nodded once. She would ride at the center, a witness to the day to come. The land opened in long yellow distances. Willow and cottonwood traced the creek like handwriting. They crossed a ford where ice tinkled like broken glass against the fetlocks. Far ahead, the boxee sat black against the winter hills, all angles and fences and calculating wealth. A rider came from the ranch first, then 2 more, then the whole shape of Kincaid's men unbent from the corrals like wolves from brush. They posted along the fence, rifles crooked. On the porch, Kincaid stood, hands folded, as if he were counting coins only he could see. Tolliver lingered behind hat-low mouth, already set for whatever lie he thought he'd need. The deputy rode forward alone until his horse's breath showed like steam and stopped inside pistol-shot distance. "We've come for the woman you stole," he said, voice even, "and for the ledger you falsified." We're taking both to Laramie. Kincaid smiled. You've come for a book. You should have brought a preacher. Or an army. No preacher, the deputy said. Just witnesses who remember where the survey stakes stood before your men moved them. Just a ledger that still stinks of fresh ink. And just enough law to get us to town. The wind ran a cold finger along the porch rail. A hawk sailed above a dark cross against the pale sky. Kincaid's eyes flicked to Tolliver. The foreman's jaw tensed. The door opened behind them. The kidnapped witness stepped into the light wrists, free now bruises yellowing around one eye. She looked at the line of riders, found the woman on the dun mare at the center, and lifted her chin in the smallest salute, a thread stretched but unbroken. Bring her down, Kincaid said. Slow. Two of his men started for the steps. That was when the Cheyenne scout raised his palm, and the town's blacksmith stepped out from behind the supply wagon with the fire poker still streaked from the last bad night, and three merchants' men who kept ledgers of their own walked into the street with shotguns held with shaking, ordinary hands. Red Oak had decided it was finished being quiet. Tolliver made the first mistake. He slid his hand under his coat, certain nobody was watching him. The Spencer's hammer spoke, and a fence post splintered an arm's width from his hand. The deputy didn't blink. Don't, he said. You get to keep your fingers if you keep them where I can see them. The wind freshened, and with it came a smell of old hay and iron. Kincaid's eyes did the arithmetic men rifles distances, the one-stair tread that groaned when a man put his weight there. He changed tactics. You think any judge will listen to her? Kincaid said, jerking his head toward the witness. Or to him, he nodded at the Cheyenne rider. You think your paper will beat land that's already fenced? The deputy's answer was quiet. No, paper won't beat your fences, but people might. He gestured to the line of townsfolk who had stopped pretending they didn't know who had been buying the judge his whiskey. And if that fails, time will. Tracks go where they go. You can't bribe a river or a railroad. You can only trespass on both for a while. Kincaid saw it then, the sum he couldn't carry. He lifted a hand, feigning surrender, and in the same motion, snapped his wrist. A derringer winked out of his sleeve, a wasp no bigger than a man's palm. And the speed of it learned from back rooms, not from battlefields. The world narrowed. Steel snapped. Someone shouted. The Cheyenne scout's elbow knocked the deputy's shoulder a hair, and the first bullet took a porch post instead of a chest. The fight was short, not clean. It never is. The Spencer boomed. Colt smoke bloomed in gray roses. A horse screamed, then a man. Tolliver lunged for the witness and caught a forearm to the throat, staggered, swung wide, and never saw the hammer that stopped him. Kincaid ran sideways along the porch rail firing, then fell when the rail itself gave way under his boot. The very carpentry he had underpaid split and betrayed him at the last. He hit the packed dirt hard enough to knock the slyness out of him and rolled the derringer skittering from his grasp. Silence broke slowly. The witness stood white-lipped, but unbroken, the rope marks at her wrists like bracelets that would fade. Tolliver lay stunned, gagging eyes, angry and wet. Kincaid stayed very still now, suddenly a man who could imagine prison in detail. Collect the book, the deputy said, and the foreman's office keys. They walked Tolliver inside at shotgun length. The office smelled of varnish and sweat and long nighttime math. In the bottom drawer behind receipt rolls and a box of cartridges lay the ledger nobody was supposed to read, the ink still shiny in parts where yesterday's numbers had been shaved and retallied. Alongside it lay the original section plats with surveyor initials scraped thin but not gone. The deputy wrapped both in oilcloth and put them in a grain sack. He looked once around the room at the walnut chair worn shiny by Kincaid's own hand, at the map. With move tacks at the framed photograph of horses Kincaid probably did not know by name. Then he walked back out into the cold. "Ride light," he told the others. "We go straight to Laramie. No stops, no boasting. Let the judge do the talking for once." They started at noon, the witness riding just behind the deputy, flanked by the Cheyenne scout, and the woman who had first given her a cup of water in the dark. Red Oak watched them go from windows and doorways, and from the smithy where the fire never really goes out. Snow began in powders and turned to sifted flour by the time the road shouldered up onto the divide. At sundown, with the wind laying knife-flat against the cheeks, Tolliver tried his last trick. He slid his wrists against the rawhide until the blood slicked it, then jerked free and drove his horse into the woman's mare to knock her down and ride for the cutbanks. He got 2 lengths, maybe 3. The scout did not shout. He leaned and took Tolliver's reins clean, then reached for the man's collar and brought him back like a sack from a high shelf. No rage, just gravity and skill. Tolliver swore and spat and in the end fell quiet. They reached Laramie under a sky so clear it rang. The judge listened longer than usual because the sheriff for once listened too. When the deputy put the ledger on the table, the judge touched the ink with a thumbnail, sniffed the oil, and said only clerk. Papers shuffled. Boots scraped. A pen found its work. Kincaid did not shout as they led him away. He looked like a man counting boards in a ceiling. Tolliver tried to hold the town's eyes and failed. The witness spoke voice steady, saying names and places and dates, and when she finished, no one asked her to say it again. It was written where it needed to be. They walked out into late light that made even the stock pens look almost fine. The deputy opened the grain sack and took out one last wrapped thing, not the ledger, not the plats. A pipe smooth from years of hands, the stem repaired once with rawhide, the bowl carved with a pattern older than any fence. He offered it to the Cheyenne scout with 2 hands. It was taken, the deputy said, on a night when the taking seemed like the only thing anyone knew how to do. The scout weighed it thumb, finding the repair without looking. He nodded once, not as forgiveness and not as refusal, something steadier than either. "You carry what you carry," he said. "Then you put it down when it is time." They rode home slow. Red Oak did not cheer. That is not how towns like that mark a day. Men brought in water. A woman opened her window. Somewhere a fiddle started a tune it knew well and did not need to finish. That night the deputy walked the length of Maine alone. He stopped once where the street dips and the mud never really dries, and he listened to the town breathe. In a window, he saw 2 silhouettes bend toward each other over a table. One of them the woman who had been taken, and then returned the other, the one who had given her water first. In the next house, a child practiced letters on grocery paper. Across the way, the blacksmith stacked tools in a line that made sense only to him. Ordinary after a long time of not. When the deputy reached the edge of town, he found the scout waiting there, horses hip-shot heads low. "You'll go north?" the deputy asked. "For a while," the scout said. "There's family near the Powder, and a river that still remembers us by name." "Tracks go where they go," the deputy said, and this time it didn't sound like defeat. The scout smiled with just his eyes. Rivers do too. But they take their time. They shook hands the way men do who have stood 3 arms lengths apart with rifles and chosen not to be enemies. Then the scout turned his horse and was part of the dark in 3 breaths. Snow came again before midnight, soft sure making all fences look the same for a few hours. Epilogue: Paper Fences Water. Spring did the patient work nobody else had time for. Snowmelt fed the creek until it filled its old banks and reminded certain posts where they should have been driven in the first place. The judge's order went up in the mercantile window, the words plain enough that the men who needed them read them twice. Kincaid's foreman signed a paper in a room with 2 witnesses and a chair that scraped the floor every time a man shifted in it. Then he left the territory without a hat. The witness took in laundry at first, because it was work, because pots do not boil on promises. In time, she ran the washing house like a small stern ship, kept ledgers of her own that never had to be changed at night, and hired a girl with a sharp laugh and good wrists to carry water and load the stove. Some evenings, she walked to the edge of town and watched the sun fold the grass and did not flinch when a rider passed behind her. Red Oak did not become rich. The railroad still ran where it ran. But the town was less afraid of its own shadow. The blacksmith built a second stall and took on a boy to sweep and to learn that iron sings before it bends. The deputy put his Spencer up on pegs and oiled it, because tools deserve care even when they are not needed today. He kept the pipe on a shelf where the light could find the carved lines. Sometimes he touched it with a thumb as he passed, not counting, not praying, just remembering that a thing taken can be carried back. When the Cheyenne scout returned in late summer, he did not come with a band or with ceremony. He rode in at noon with dust to his knees and a trout hanging from a willow stick. He found the deputy at the pump and nodded toward the ridge where the cottonwoods keep their own counsel. They ate by the creek, and the scout told a story about a cousin's colt that had learned to open a gate with its lips. They did not talk about the day at the Boxee until the light went gold and the water went black. Then they said a few plain words a man can hold and carried the rest in silence. That night, in a house with a lamplight that made the wallpaper look warmer than it was, 2 women folded shirts and set them in a chest. The younger of them, who had once been found cold and shaking in a place that smelled of varnish and bad paper, pressed her palm flat to the last shirt and let herself breathe all the way to the bottom. Outside, a fiddle tried the same tune and failed it twice, and found it the 3rd time. A baby down the street learned what laughter sounded like. By autumn, the creek had cut a clean line where the surveyors said it should. Men measured and nodded and set posts without looking over their shoulders first. Nobody called it justice. Folks in Red Oak did not use words with edges like that. They called it sordid. They called it steady. They called it enough. And on a morning when the frost painted every window with the same fern leaf pattern, a rider going north crossed paths with a rider coming south. They lifted hands, one with an old scar across the knuckle, one with fresh rope burns faded to cords. The hands looked almost the same in the cold. They did not stop. They did not need to. The road between them stayed open.